Welcome to the Honest to Godcast, podcast dedicated to learning the truth, and the truth will set you free. I'm your host, Stephen B. Hello, I'm your host, Stephen B. Thanks for stopping by and hanging out with me today. For those of you that already know my channel, I just want to let you guys understand that yeah, I had to take some time off. I was grieving. My my youngest son passed, and there's no greater pain that a parent can have than to have one of their children pass before they do. But that's the reason I haven't been very active. But I'm checking in today, and I wanted to let you know about something that's coming up on March 7th. It's going to be published on the william-branham.org website, and on YouTube it's the channel is called Leaving the Message. And I got invited to that podcast and told my story of how I co-pastored a group down in the 70s. I co-pastored a group that ultimately ended up being on suicide watch later on in life. But anyway, when I see someone that's doing a really tremendous job out there on the internet, I want to plug them. So I'm going to play a little snippet here so that you can see who John Collins is, and get the links and so forth in this. And anyway, I appreciate y'all for stopping by.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have my very special guest, Stephen Burris, former member of The Message under Pastor Jim Jones. Stephen, it's good to hear from you and to have you on the podcast to share your story. I know everybody's going to hear that introduction and they're going to think, oh my gosh, Jim Jones. But we're talking about a different Jim Jones that was also in the Message cult following of William Branham. This particular Jim Jones we're talking about was he was the pastor of the Spoken Word Tabernacle in Phoenix, if I remember correctly, and they did not quite end up into a Jonestown scenario, but they got pretty close. So maybe if we could just start and you could tell everybody a little bit about yourself.
Okay. First, let me say how grateful I am that you're having me on, John. I've been watching your podcast and getting into you go so deep into this research. I'm truly impressed, and I'm excited to be here today. Thank you. I saw that it's about an 11-minute video that you have called Death Cults, and you have the snippet from the newspaper in there, and it does call him Jim Jones, which is something that the media, I guess, they try to make the connection between him and Jim Jones from, the Guyana massacre. Right? And so your research is fascinating. I'm just really, when I saw that video, I wanted to come and talk and because I was involved in that church. But we have to go back in time, back to the 70s. And 70s were an interesting time. I mean, it seemed like there were so many millenarian groups out there that were trying to usher in the millennium. Um, there were Jehovah Witnesses and Mormons every 15 feet knocking on doors. There was the Jesus movement, the Children of God movement. It just seemed like it was everywhere. And I was a hippie and I had no intention of, uh, being a Christian or anything like that. I was out there, with the super long hair, throwing beer cans at the law and shouting peace, peace. And I had no intention, of ever being a Christian. Well, I started my journey, and I had a girlfriend she was Nazarene. I went to a Baptist church for a while. I tried a Pentecostal church. And so my brother had given me the album Jesus Christ Superstar. And of course, a lot of the Christians, they didn't like it and they were griping about it. But I listened to it anyway, and it affected me in a positive way. And so I met James. His name is James L. Jones, and L stands for Linville, by the way. He never wanted anybody to know that. But what happened was I was in my room, sitting on my bed, and I had read in the Bible, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 5, where it says there's one Lord, one faith, one baptism, right? And I was just a young Christian at the time, just barely, wet behind the ears as it was, just got baptized maybe a few days earlier. And bear with me, I have allergies. So a friend at school invited me to a revival. It was at the Glendale Women's Club. This is back in 71. And so I went to this revival, and there was a guy up there on the platform, kind of a Andy Griffith looking dude. And he preached like a house on fire. I'd never heard anybody preach that way. And he was so good. Best I ever saw at creating group thought, or what I call the mastermind. And I got that from Napoleon Hill's book, where he talks about the psychology aspect of the Pentecostal revival. And so, he's very dynamic in his approach. And I'd never heard preaching like that before. The sermon was called Hear Ye Him, and it was based on the scriptures, about the Mount of Transfiguration experience, where the voice says, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. Hear ye him." And anyway, like I said, he was a fantastic preacher. And when he would preach, there was a vein that would stick out on his neck. This is my first time seeing him, right? And I'm looking at him and I'm thinking, he's gonna break a blood vessel in his neck. And so he was like, I'll demonstrate. He's up there preaching away, and God said, "Hear ye him, raise your hands and shout amen." So, he was really wound up. And then he turned and looked right at me. He goes, "And there's a young man here tonight that thinks I'm going to break a blood vessel in my neck." And I was like, whoa, what just happened?
Wow, I bet that would freak you out, man. People accuse me of being against all of the doing the stuff, all of the signs and wonders, etc. But I've been under ministries who had some figure who would say something not quite to that level, but something similar. They would say something that afterwards, whenever it happened, you're scratching your head thinking, wait a minute, how did he know that? And I can't say that all of them were prophetic revelations, but some of them may have bordered on that edge. And the problem is, as we'll get further into this episode, and I think people will understand, there are ministries where people have something unusual, whether it's a gift or whether they have inside knowledge or Maybe they did have a vision. I don't know. But it doesn't really mean that the person is number one, a safe person, because as we'll get into, this is a horrific story, what happened. But also, you can't really say that it is a movement by God. Just because some person is doing something, you can't really equate that to a divinely inspired movement as we get into this. But what happened after this? What did it make you think?
I'd had experiences like that with my mother. One time the phone rang and before we answered it, she said, "Oh my God, it's Fred. He shot himself." And that's what happened. My Uncle Fred tried to end his life and he shot himself and ended up being, a quadriplegic for the rest of his life. And so I knew a little bit about those, gifts. And so, anyway, without missing a beat, after he said, "There's a young man here that thinks I'm going to break a blood vessel in my neck," without skipping a beat, he went right back to his sermon. And then when the sermon was over, he started ministering to people. And he walked up to me. And like I said earlier that day, I was reading Ephesians 4:5, and I thought, how can it be possible to have one Lord, one faith, one baptism with 969 different denominations? And why I thought 969, I don't know, but it's important in my story because when he had me stand up, he said, "Young man, you were sitting in your room today, you were reading Ephesians chapter 4, verse 5 about one Lord, one faith, one baptism. And you wondered, how could that possibly be with 969? It was word for word perfect." And then right after that, he said, "I'm going to prove I'm not reading minds here." And he put his finger on a scar that I had and told me how old I was and how I got it. Um, He had a jar with alcohol in it with a tumor that had 2 day long roots on it. That I wasn't there for that meeting. It was like a week or two prior where he had called a woman out and prayed for her cancer. She got sick, went into the restroom, and she passed this tumor. I saw him do things like wipe a cataract out of a man's eye and wipe it on his suit, crossed eyes, healed, the whole 9 yards. And so when he was telling me, uh, you know, the thoughts of my heart, he said, he gave me an answer. He said, "The book of Acts is a record of the church in action. And if you believe like they did and act like they did, you can have what they had." And so that was where the first seed was planted. It wasn't like our church at the time thought it was mandatory. If you're a Christian, you're going to work miracles, right? But it was like, if you're not working miracles and if there's no signs and wonders, then you really have no confirmation that what you're preaching and teaching is correct, is kind of how it was presented.
And for me, that's one of the real problems with this type of movement. I've mentioned it in a few of my podcasts, but it isn't so much that I'm against those things, doing the stuff. It's the fact that the stuff, the quote-unquote stuff, gets overemphasized. So in the balance scales, you've got the Bible and you've got sound doctrine, you've got focus on Jesus, etc. As a Christian, well, then some of these movements, they really lessen that so that they can lift up the stuff and they can have people focus on it. So I'm curious, before we recorded this, we talked a bit, and you were, I guess, in the ministry with this person, this James Jones. How did all of that come about? How did you become, a leader in this sect?
I asked him to mentor me. And he said, "Yeah, I'll take you under my wing." And eventually I was ordained and licensed through the James L. Jones Evangelistic Association. We outgrew the women's club when we bought a church and had, I don't know, it got up to around 150 or so regular tithe paying members. We were on the radio, KASA, 1540 on your AM dial down there in Phoenix. And people started coming to the meetings. And um, so after this is like baby steps over a few years. And this is how we ended up being a message church, actually. The tone of his sermons started to change. Like one day, he came out and he preached a sermon called Cain, son of Satan, which is serpent seed. It's just, it was a rebranded, and he acted as if it was his revelation knowledge. People in the Pentecostal movement at that time, they would mention Branham, of course, and he said, "Well, I never met Branham. I don't know Branham. I don't know what he taught or anything like that. But when I would go visit him in his house, I would see the Branham books in his library, and I would do a critical analysis of these sermons that he did, like, pre out of my generation, son of Satan, which is rebranded and all of that. And it seemed like at that time there were different classifications in the message. Some of them would just the ministers, they would just kowtow, and Branham was it, and I don't want to be a carnal impersonator, and so they wouldn't, pray for the sick even or whatever. But then there were the other guys, which is a category that James L. Jones ended up falling into, like, Neil Frisbee would be one, where they were going to outdo Branham. If Branham was Elijah, they're Elisha. If Branham was Moses, then they're Joshua. And so I started getting the sense that because we got all the books, and that's it. I like to be brief and be done. But anyway, there was a snippet from my interview with John Collins. YouTube channel is Leaving the Message, and you can get a lot of information at the website william-branham.org. And I'm pretty sure that John wouldn't mind me plugging his show. It's one of the better ones that's out there. Anyway, that's it for now. Hopefully, we'll be checking back in with you again very, very soon.